Okay, welcome everyone to our final installment of the Rugby Canada Match Official Professional Development webinar series. Tonight we're going to take a look at just wrapping up our content for the year and how we can use this information to help us prep for the next season. So as always, for those of us who are on the call, there is a text question box where you guys can put some questions if you do have any, and then we can address anything that people have at the end or throughout. And then, as always, this will be recorded and posted online. The big takeaway will obviously be working towards next year. So without further ado, we'll take a look at some of our objectives. So we'll take a look at reviewing our general topics of discussion that we had over the course of the year. We'll take a look at how we can use this year's content to help us prep for next year. And then just a quick final reminder about the high tackle framework and what it'll mean for us going into the next season. So to take a look at this year's content, we did have 12 modules, one in each month. And then what we did was we took a look at last year at the end of 2018, we put together a brief survey to our refereeing and rugby stakeholders community to look at what some of those issues around or areas for improvement within our refereeing group or members. And what we did was we came up with a webinar a month type of schedule. We had to miss one, unfortunately, due to logistics, and we've had to move a couple around due to, some personal things. We got some great feedback along the way. We tried to diversify in terms of a couple of different speakers that will definitely be improved on going into next year, as well as trying to use more video throughout. So those were some of the things that came up. However, one of the things we really wanted to accomplish was discussing player welfare in each module. Some of them around, especially around some of the technical areas that had contact areas as a point of focus. For example, our fourth module on the tackle ruck, our fifth module on the scrum, our sixth module on restarts and lineouts, which tended to include a little bit of maul stuff as well. Those three, especially taking a look at the player welfare portion of how we go about adjudicating those areas of the game with safety and top of mind. The other thing we did, and we'll take a look at what it looks like in a second, but we related each of our modules to the Rugby Canada referee profile. So out of the content came, or the content development for this came, what the key components we wanted to try and address within our referees over the course of a year, using some of this content, as well as our coach and match officials getting some of this information in order to try and coach those particular key factors that we identified in each of those pillars. So we'll go through that in a moment. The main focus over the course of the structure of the modules was to look to build our referees up for success. So when we started with our game preparation and review module, we looked at, hey, how do we go into a match prepared to work on a couple of things. We addressed our age grade variations. How do we referee under 19s rugby, especially with the high school season coming up? And then we looked at positioning specifically as its own standalone module in March, our third module, because putting ourselves in a good position to see the contact area from the same position repeatedly gives us a steady focus and a steady picture when it comes to that part of the game, which is the majority of our refereeing, is managing that breakdown area. So if we could put ourselves in a good spot, that might help us to be able to adjudicate that part of the game a little bit better. So we focused on that. And then we looked at some technical pieces just to make sure we all had a basic understanding of how we set ourselves up for success. This was especially the case with set piece, pardon me, our setup of set piece. And then we looked at, okay, now how do we take our refereeing to the next step when it came to our communication, our management of the offside line, and our fitness and personal well-being and piece like that. So as I mentioned, there will be a bit of a review going into next year. One of the concerns was that 12 modules was quite a bit, not necessarily from my perspective in terms of putting content together, but rather getting enough viewers and enough interaction with the content. The second part of that is making it more interactive some way. So we will be taking a look at some of these options as well as more guest speakers, if you will, especially around some of the technical areas and some of the off-field mental pieces. For instance, the managing stress piece is going to be a big one, I think, for next year that I think we would get a lot of traction with. So some changes coming, but if anyone has any feedback, please be sure to provide them. We are also looking, we did get some good feedback on the scheduling and making sure we stick to the scheduling, and we will be putting some I guess measures in place to make sure that we're not moving away from the scheduled times. All right, so just to re-emphasize some of the pieces around our player welfare, the high tackle framework was really pushed, and it'll continue to be a focus next year. And then we did use some video examples of how we want to try and make sure we adjudicate that foul play piece, much of which was provided by World Rugby, but it does give us, there were some examples of what we used or what we can see in the domestic game. The high tackle framework training that was conducted across the country throughout July, late June, early July would have provided some good context around domestic competitions and what foul play can look like in those competitions. So just something to be aware of. From a technical perspective, again, that focus for success, which I touched on earlier. And then the side note to that is our coach of match official insight into how we can help referees with purposeful practice and looking at opportunities to develop midweek as a referee. So one of the attitudes we want to work on with our coach of match officials going into next year, especially, is taking our content where we want to get to with our officials and how we want them to develop on a Saturday, knowing that we can't use games as practice, although we do to a certain degree. We want to start moving to using midweek opportunities as practice. And so instead of just saying on a Sunday or Monday, review the game from the previous Saturday, and then here's what I'm going to work on the following Saturday, and not really address that until that game comes up, we'd like to now look at focusing on, hey, here's one or two things during the week that you can incorporate into your daily life. Or instead of going out for a run by yourself, you're going to maybe a training session with a club and working on your positioning or working on something that's, scrum setup, that kind of thing with teams. So just looking at how we can use other ways of working on our areas of improvement without waiting till that next game. And then we wanted to take a bit of a holistic approach. So there's a bit of content on as many kind of variety different topics that we tried to develop. But again, as part of our feedback, if anyone has any, or part of your feedback, if anyone has any pieces they'd like to add or have change going into next year. Again, we're not sure what that's going to look like, whether we'll stick with 12. I doubt that. We'll probably move to 6 and spread them out, maybe make them a little bit longer, but then have more interactive content with another presenter type thing. Anyways, we tried to address some of those off-field or non-technical pieces of the game with, our game management and our personal well-being and stuff like that. So that's basically the gist of the content. But for anyone who wants to take a look at any of those previous 12 or 11, 10 modules, go to Rugby Canada's YouTube page, and then they're all there within the playlist. So for the remainder of our time tonight, and this won't take too long, but what we're going to do is look at how do we use our Rugby Canada referee profile and our match review form to help prep for next year. Just so we know what's coming, there will be a coach of match official professional development session in each province conducted with the CMOs that will look at how do we use this content more specifically with our referees. So in 2019, we presented the content and we put it out there for people to be able to use, but it wasn't really monitored and there was no real tracking of how it was being used. Going into 2020, we're not necessarily going to track a whole lot at the moment just because of capacity, but what we will be doing is more focused training with our coach and match officials on the content available and the resources available and how we can use those on a week-to-week basis with our officials. So there were 3 key pillars: game management, technical, and tactical, and then 5 key factors within each of those that we identified. Wanting our referees to be able to work on a little bit throughout the year. And I think when we all have an opportunity to go back and look at our post-match reviews in whatever form those are, let's start as an individual referee. What stands out? So that's the first question I would ask myself. Is it more game management areas? Is it more technical, or is it more tactical areas that I need to improve on? The next question I would have is, and this is if I did have a coach and match official who was able to see me at some point throughout the year, but were we on the same page? Sometimes we're not, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. What it can signify often is that there's both maybe a misunderstanding of priorities, or there's a different interpretation, I guess, of what might be most relevant in a game. Again, not necessarily a bad thing. What I would do is say, if we're not on the same page as our coach and match official, it might be worth going back and having another phone call with them or another email exchange just to look at, hey, what do they believe are the most important things that I might need to take away going into the next season? And then the next question is it something that's outside of the profile here? So if it's not one of these 15 kind of key factors, and some of them, I mean, it'd be difficult for us to say we're going to focus on this in our off season, you know, establishing a positive environment. I mean, it might necessarily be that there are ways to be able to address that, but you know, in essence, you know, zero tolerance for foul play. Okay, well, how do I work on that in the off season? Might be kind of difficult. I mean, we can certainly be creative in how we look at adapting our daily life to address it. But I think the bigger takeaway is there a technical or tactical area of the game, or something about the way I manage people that I can work on? Or is it something that's kind of outside of the scope of the profile, i.e. my nutrition or my fitness or my personal well-being, or whatever that might be? Now, just so we know, the reason why the Rugby Canada referee profile doesn't have nutrition and fitness in it is because what we're trying to do is encourage all of us, regardless of whatever level of refereeing we're doing, we're trying to address the same factors. Not all of us will be able to hit the same fitness standards, and that's okay, because we're not here to judge or to work towards everyone being the fittest referee in the world. Some of us just want to go out on a Saturday and enjoy a good rugby game and still referee competently, and that's just as valuable to the game. And so that doesn't mean we can't work on some of these key pillars, though, and still referee the game well, while not necessarily being super focused on our fitness. So if it is something outside of the profile, great, but it's just something we want to make sure is a priority. If our goal is to move up in the refereeing ranks, if we will, then yes, the fitness side of things is important, and it's part of the whole setting ourselves up for success. So if our positioning is really weak, is it because we're not fit enough? You know, taking a look at the whys it is that we're not necessarily able to achieve certain outcomes that we're looking for. So something to keep in mind. So those are the 3 questions I would ask myself at the end of the year. I'll go back through my post-match reviews and I'll say, hey, what are the key things that stood out for me? Does that match with what the feedback was from my coach and match official? And then is there anything outside of these kind of 15 items within our key factors here that I'd want to address? So then the next step for me would be to go and take a look at ranking my areas of improvement from most important to least important. And it's not to say that there's any right or wrong here. This is just a personal reflection. So again, for example, if I was to say that the technical aspect of my game was to me the most important piece of what I needed to improve, then fantastic. If it was something to do with my behavior and how I comported myself with captains, then great. That's the piece that I'm going to take away to work on. But I think this is a very personal piece. And a coach, match official, or another referee can certainly be there to help you, try and figure that out for yourself. So again, I'd ask myself one more question here around, are these resources for improvement, have they been provided through the webinar series so far? So, if it's a very technical area of the game, but it might not have been covered in either scrum, tackle, ruck, line out, etc. Okay, well then where do I go to find that, right? And this is something we'll look at in a second. But yeah, so where else can we go for assistance? And I think this is where, again, I can only put so much info here because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is I guess, demonstrate or show how we're modeling the behavior of being flexible in the sense of saying, hey, whatever works best for you as an individual is the direction you should go. So I can describe examples and give examples, but at the end of the day, I think it's up to each individual to be able to address what it is that works for them. So let's just say the area of the scrum is where I need the most work. I can certainly go and watch this webinar, but at the end of the day, we do really encourage individuals to go out and practice refereeing the scrum, especially the scrum, if it's an area that needs improvement, just because it is such a, it's one of those areas of the game where, taking a look at big picture versus the pressure of making decisions in the moment versus taking care of the safety side of things, all happening within a quick split second means that we make decisions very quickly, and the practice that we can put into it in a non-pressurized environment certainly helps. So where else can we go for assistance, right? So just taking a look at getting in touch with our coach of match officials, clubs, other referees, and then online resources where they might be available. And then finally, the last step is to take a look at, hey, here's what my off-season planning would look like. So I'll take 2 or 3 areas that I want to improve in and focus on those in my off-season. For those who are looking to kind of work their way up a little bit into higher levels of refereeing, I would encourage that the areas referees want to look at is certainly in the technical side of things, but also in the game management side of things. So what separates referees at the top level is they're all pretty accurate for the most part on the technical side of rugby. Everyone's going to miss things, everyone's going to make mistakes, we all accept that. The question is, how well are we able to work within that framework during a match? So the areas of our communication with captains and using our decisions to help modify or change player behavior when it comes to infringements is a key area of focus. And then as well as making sure that in the course of making decisions, we're not getting caught up in the decisions and letting that have a bit of a snowball effect into a whistle happy kind of referee, but rather how are we able to use the trends we're seeing to try and get the players to buy into changing their behavior a little bit. Sometimes that requires a lot of listening, right? And making sure we're on the same page. So just making an effort to identify what those are. So for all of us who are in club referee land, which has primarily been the focus of the PD sessions, is to take a look at what are the 2 or 3 areas, and then how can I work on those over the course of the off season. The next question I would ask is, how do I learn best? So some of us by looking or watching, some of us by reading and writing. Writing, as much as we don't do it very much nowadays, even if it's just in point form, really helps to reinforce learning. So when we're watching a webinar and we jot down a few key points, even if they're already on a screen, writing something down, just that active motion and then looking at what you're writing often helps us internalize that memory. So just keep that in mind when you're going through some online video work or some reading. Or do you learn best by actively doing things? Adult learning models tend to show that the more we practice something, the more we're able to retain that information. That includes, the verbal side of things. So putting ourselves in a place where we're actually delivering something. So if let's just say it's, again, just sticking with the theme of the scrum, refereeing the scrum is our area of work. Let's just say we had 3 other referees in our community who decided, yeah, that's the same for them. Great, let's all 4 of us go to a training session where they're going to work with the scrum. And for me to actively work with those referees and walk through or talk through decisions that they're making as they're setting up the scrum, etc., that helps reinforce my learning. So just keep that in mind as you go through the process of how you want to set up your off-season work, is looking at, okay, I as a referee learn best by doing this, or as a person, how do I incorporate that into my refereeing? Okay, and then how do you put your plan into action? So again, this is very personal. Some of us write things down into big plans. Some of us just put 3 things in point form on our fridge and sit there and say, hey, every Monday and Wednesday and Friday, I'm in the gym. Or every Tuesday, I'm out at this club working with this coach, or something like that, right? How do you put your own plan into action? Some of us will use our phone and our reminders. Some of us will make sure that we schedule training dates or video sessions with our fellow referees, and that way they can hold us accountable, right? So that brings me to my last point. There's some examples here. Is how do you hold yourself accountable? So for me, I know that it's setting dates to things. So by certain dates, trying to meet certain things, as much as sometimes I have to push things further along down the road sometimes, but that tends to work well for me. But the flip side of that is having someone who I know is gonna be in touch with me. So someone who's aware, right? So a colleague who's aware of what it is we're trying to achieve, and then how do I touch base with them? So making sure that there's someone I can bounce ideas off. The one thing I would encourage everyone to do as they go through this off-season planning piece is to look at keeping things simple. So I put a note here about success coming in increments. We talked a lot about this during the nutrition presentation as well that Ashley did, and as well as the fitness one that Phil Dunn did for us last month. So if any of us thinks we're going to take a fitness plan and all of a sudden hit the the test score that we're looking for, whether it's in the Bronco or something like that, I think some of us will potentially achieve that. But the reality is most of us are going to look to make a couple of small changes. So what I would encourage us to do is, if I was to say the scrum area is my biggest area of weakness, okay, well, is it my setup? And I'm just going to focus my off season on how am I going to address setup issues at the scrum. If, let's say, my setup's not bad, but it comes down to certain decisions when it comes to who might be collapsing our scrum, whether they're doing it on purpose or not, we still need to sometimes penalize that. So if we were to say under 19s and we end up having some collapses on the set, right, do we need to look at penalizing? Do we need to look at uncontested, etc.? How do we look at what's happening in order to help us be better able to address that part of the game? So what I'd say for that particular instance is maybe I need to feel what it's like, not necessarily in a full-on scrum, but if I was to say, hey, I'm going to go to this club, there's a front row player, I'm just going to see, can they walk me through and just have me feel what it's like to feel a little bit of pressure one-on-one when they get their head under my chest, when they're able to just, put a little bit of pressure on my arm. What does that feel like? What does that do to your body? How does that put you off balance? Sometimes having an understanding of what it feels like to go into that part of the game or that area can help us better adjudicate it. And then the last part might be to just look at some video, right? So, looking at key triggers and body positions that help us identify who's maybe in a weaker scrummaging position than our opposition, right? So looking at strong versus weak body positions, that kind of thing. And then having a plan of attack. So whatever works best for you as an individual, that's just the example we've kind of been running with throughout. But I'm sure that there's, your fellow referees, your coach match official, your referee administrators within your province who are going to be able to help you identify some of those resources. Okay, so that's really it in terms of how do we use some of this stuff. A lot of it is questions, and I think for me the most important part is, are you as an individual able to take what you feel is working well for you and improve on that, and then what some of the areas for improvement are, and then what can you do in your everyday life to help address some of those things, especially from a game management and managing people perspective. Are we able to make some changes in our behavior at home versus our behavior with our friends or at work in order to help, put ourselves in an environment where we, more or less, I guess, have an environment that replicates, if we will, the rugby pitch, right? And what that looks like, and whether or not we can use that to our advantage. So things to think about. But what I'm encouraging us all to do is take a look at that referee profile, just to go back to it real quick, and what those pillars are, and seeing if those are the areas, because those will be a focus of our coach and match officials next year. And it does seem to be the areas within which our referees can look to improve over the course of their refereeing career, if we will. Okay, just a couple of other pieces here for our coach and match officials. So some of the things they can do to help our referees with their planning is ensure that the referee is on the same page with those areas for improvement. So is there a discrepancy between you as a CMO and your assessments versus their reflections? If so, how do we get on the same page? So it might require a bit of a phone call, might require an email. It might require, again, we want to make it centered on the referee, right? So coaches focus on player-centered approaches to their coaching. As a CMO, we want to focus on referee-centered approaches to our referees. So it can go two ways. One is if it's a real big safety thing that the referee simply is not on the same page with you with, it might be worth pushing some of that information to them to make sure that they're able to better understand what it is we're coming from, and that the safety piece especially is a critical part of their refereeing. The flip side of that is if our big focus as a CMO was on, managing the offside line, and their big focus, identified focus, was on identifying the tackler and tackle assist and the difference between those two individuals sometimes, and having a clear picture of everyone releasing, then we might be able to say, you know what, okay, let's just go with the referee and make sure that they've got a good plan in their off season for trying to address that particular area of the game. And then the next big question is for the CMO is look at, if you're going to help the referee review their off-season plan, the biggest question that the CMO can ask is, how do you plan on achieving this? So we use the example of fitness here. Referee wants to improve fitness and work to get to X standard, whatever that might be. The question that a CMO can really help them with is, how do they achieve that, right? Is it by finding a gym buddy? Is it by, Phil mentioned in his session, working on speed versus cardio for most of us, because the speed is the first thing to go. So within certain frameworks of refereeing, the cardio is important But if we're working on our speed and doing training for speed, that actually does in some ways help improve our cardio as well, or at least maintain our cardio as well. So let's, focus on the speed side of things first. What does that look like, etc. The biggest reference I have, or the best reference I have for the how, is referees, coach and match officials will often say, okay, well, your positioning isn't great here. Okay, well, why is that? Okay, well, I'm just not getting from point A to point B quick enough. Okay, so then the referee says, great, I'm going to work on getting there quicker. Well, what does that actually mean to say I'm going to work on getting there quicker, right? Is it improving my first 3 steps off the mark? Is it improving my fitness in general? Is it leaving before the ball's off the ground, right? What are the triggers we're going to work on, right? If we say that our post-match reviews include wanting to address our scrum setup, okay, well, what about our scrum setup? Because if our previous set of scrum setup wasn't very good, we need to do something different about how we set up that scrum to make it better, right? So is it by taking a specific point in the scrum or a specific pair of bodies to look at their binds? So I would say on my left side, when I'm setting up the scrum, I'll always look at that loose head hooker bind and make sure that the shoulder is showing. And it's just a trigger to help me make sure that I'm always looking at that. And then I can obviously then look at everyone else, because if I'm going to look at one team, I might as well look at the other, right? So just finding ways to address the how. If a CMO can really help with that, I think that'll end up being a really big part of how a referee can go about setting their off-season plan. And then hold the referee accountable. So establish check-in periods throughout the off-season. So for CMOs, everyone needs a break, that's for sure. And we're not necessarily looking at, being in touch with a group of referees once a week again, as we might have been throughout the season. But to have opportunities throughout the off season where we schedule in a couple of phone calls with our particular few referees, or with our group of referees that we might have been assigned to, however our provincial group has structured their coach of match officiating, just pick a couple points and have a couple discussions and see whether or not they're able to hold themselves accountable to that plan. And then we can get into the next season's kind of planning and addressing those issues as we go through the 2020 year. For those of us in BC, and I just, this thought came to me, obviously we're in the middle of our season. They're on a bit of a break at the moment. But for you guys in BC, certainly things that can be taken away for your Christmas holidays, getting ready for the BC Rugby Conference coming up in the second week of Jan. And then, once the season, the 15s club season's over in May, taking a look at employing some of these strategies going into planning your 2020-2021 year. And then, as we always do, we've got the info here about, sorry, I think my computer's frozen. Yeah, there we go. So here's the info, obviously, with regards to the high tackle framework. So implemented as of July 1st this year. Please go and take a look online if you have any concerns or questions about it. There will be communication from Rugby Canada out to start 2020, just to remind people that the framework is out there, it is to be used, and that we do have a zero tolerance outlook on for our refereeing. We want to have a zero tolerance approach to foul play, right? So making sure that we're addressing unnecessary contact, especially from tacklers who are in poor tackling positions. Obviously, the context of the game dictates our decision making, pick and goes around the goal line, etc. So that's a wrap for today. I really wanted to try and just focus on asking the questions and seeing if you guys could come away with a couple of key things that you identified through the year, and then some strategies for how you might want to take a look at addressing your off-season planning. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to hang around for a little bit. A question came in to say thanks. You're welcome, Kevin. looks like that's it. Nothing coming in at the moment. Okay, so with that, I will say thank you very much. We've got our last one tomorrow with our session in French, and then soon in 2020, we will have an announcement as to what our development program will look like when we release our training and education calendar around the third week of January. In the meantime, I wish you all a very happy holidays, a very Merry Christmas, whatever it is you might celebrate, and hopefully everyone is safe and is recharged for 2020. Thanks again, and I look forward to chatting with you all soon.